Lekh Lecha begins the story of the Jewish people, and it begins with Avraham Avinu and Sarai Menu. The two of them were unique in that they didn't conform with society, and that is a major theme of Avraham Avinu's life that I want to explore in this year's presentation of Lekh Lecha. So the Hachamim say, Ma'aseh Avot Siman Banim. They say that what the Avot did, Abraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, they are signals. They are essentially signposts for us in terms of our own lives as members of the Jewish people, children of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, that we can look to their lives and recognize not only the patterns of their lives, the choices of their lives, the attributes of these people, and recognize that that plays into, that teaches us something about our own lives, what it is that we go through not only as a people, but as individual members of the people. And this attribute of Avraham Avinu, that he was essentially an iconoclast, he was an individual that did not simply conform to society. Now, it's true that the Hachamim see this, and they really do bring this out in so many midrashim, the glosses that they put on the stories that we have in the Mikra, in the Psukim, the written text of Avraham Avinu's life, as the Torah presents it. But we also recognize it in the text itself, that Avraham Avinu was set apart. And it starts with the very name of the parasha, Lekh Lecha. The fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Avraham Avinu, Avraham, continue your journey. And now, why is it continue your journey? Because the truth of the matter is that already from Parashat Noah, we see that Avraham Avinu was setting out, leaving the place that he grew up in, leaving the place that he knew to be home, and all that was essentially familiar to him. And of course, familiar is related to family. What it is that he was born into, the world that was basically given to him when he came into the world and grew up in the world. And one thing that we recognize is that not only does he begin to do this, HaKadosh Baruch Hu encourages him at the beginning of this week's parasha to continue to do this, and says, Lech lecha mi bet avicha, leave your father's house, from the place that you were born, from what it is that's familiar and that you know, and you go el haaretz asher areka, go to the land that I will show you. But it isn't just a command to go, it is a command to go for his own sake. And the fact that it does not just say, Lech Abraham, go Abraham. It says, Lech lecha, go for you, Abraham. Go for the person that you are, the individual that you are, essentially the person that God loves. And as Michael Wishograd would say, the person that God fell in love with. And when we talk about Avraham in that way, we are not talking about just one aspect of Avraham Avinu. We're not just talking about a behavior of his, a philosophy of his, the way that he lived. We're talking about all of it. Everything about Avraham Avinu, the whole person, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves the entire person. Now, what's important is to recognize that Avraham Avinu strove to achieve his full identity, to achieve the full, unique individual that he was. And what I mean by identity is simply not something that is kind of, attached on socially, politically, familially even. It's to become who he is, right? To achieve, really, the human being that he is, and what we recognize in all of ourselves, that we're different. All of us are very different. And the way that we live, the way that we see the world, the thoughts that we have are very different from those around us. And, as the Hachamim like to say, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is remarkable in that regard, that although he uses the same dye, so to speak, in order to be able to develop humans and create humans, because we all kind of have the same basic faculties, the same basic anatomies and all of that. I mean, a couple eyes and ears and a nose and a mouth, and it's remarkable the diversity that we end up coming out with when you basically start with those basic components. Every face is different. And although people might look like each other, we recognize that that's very much a hallmark of the human race. It's truly, the truth of the matter is that it's a hallmark of the entirety of creation, right? I mean, one thing that we know is ubiquitous in creation is the individuation or the individualization of creation. That, the old cliche, no two leaves on a tree, no two fingerprints, no two snowflakes, right? Things are different in this world. And although there might be similarities to them, difference is very much a hallmark of the world and life on this planet. And the basic, it's not only life, but pretty much everything that comprises this planet. Difference is ubiquitous. And that is an important principle because human beings have a paradoxical experience in our lives when it comes to that. What is that? Well, we are also a profoundly social species. We conform to those around us. We have a very strong sense of needing to belong. We have a very strong sense of wanting to be part of the group. And of course, there is the part of the in-group and the out-group and all of that. But fundamentally, we are social and we do need each other. And because we need each other, and we need each other profoundly, not just for survival on an evolutionary perspective, but we need each other just for our own health, right? We are not loners. We do need to be able to be part of society and a communal experience. The majority of us anyway. And being that that's the case, we are also a species that conforms. We tend very, very much to do what others do, think like others think, speak like others speak, basically move in the world as the others around us do. And we tend to negatively look at those that don't, those that do dare to be different. And now that is, pretty much those issues, the issues of individuality and social cohesion and conformity and community, those issues are pretty much as old as human beings. And it's one of the hardest things for human beings to be able to balance and reconcile. How do we maintain our individuality and at the same time conform to society without erasing the unique individuals that we are? That was a major move of Avraham Avinu. He was not just an individual. He set out as an iconoclast to become the individual self that he was. And at the same time, we see him as the Ava Chesed. He is the man of life-giving kindness, of welcoming, of opening, of cultivating the world and the people around him. And the story of his life really deals with the tension between those two things. But what we open with is an Avraham Avinu who is on his way to developing his own individual life. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu opens the parasha saying to him, Lekh, Lekha, go for yourself, Avraham. Do it, and I will support you in everything that you do. I will bless you, and I will make sure that you get to that end. Now, the reason why I wanted to focus on this, of course, it's a major attribute of Avraham Avinu, but this is something that I think we are really, really struggling with on an individual level, and I think on a societal level today. There is a huge push, on the one hand, for all of us to kind of, stand for our own selves, to hold our personal truths, to believe in what it is that we believe in, right? And to find that, and to find what is true to me, and to find what it is that is my true self. All of that rhetoric, that's a very big part of the world in which we live today. It's a very big part of the modern world. And it wasn't always the case. And the truth of the matter is that this is also a cultural thing, right? So if we look towards the East, what we call the East, we're on a globe, but if we look towards the East, we do find that the tendency of societies in the East is to think much more in terms of societal values as opposed to individual values. And the more west we go, the more individuality becomes a major thing, and societal cohesion, in the sense of I look at myself as a member of society first and an individual second. Very strong on the Eastern side of things, right? That is very much how people look at things on the Eastern side of things. Very much not how people in the West tend to look at things. Things are very individual. I would suggest a book to you on this called The Geography of Thought, which is written by Nisbet. And he was actually a guest on my podcast on Humans Being. And the book was actually recommended to me originally by Rabbi Sachs. But it's a fascinating book that kind of looks at the fact, at these differences in society. Nonetheless, as I read this and as I thought about this, I thought, well, what are the Jews like? And I really do believe, and actually heard somebody say this on a podcast that I was listening to recently. As a matter of fact, if I'm not mistaken, it was on the last episode of the Dan Senior podcast, in which he had Nadav Eyal and Amit Segal on, which he always has on, but they were doing a live recording in New York City at the Stryker Center. Just for those who are watching this on, may not be in contemporary points, we're on 28th October 2025, and so it was just a few days ago. But it was pointed out on the podcast that we are very much in balance between these two things, the Jewish people. On the one hand, we really do hold individual identity, the self, as tremendously high, with tremendously high regard. It is something that is essential for us to do, and we see that throughout the writings of the Hachamim. And the most famous, of course, is Hillel HaZaken, Im ena nili mili. If I'm not going to watch for myself, take care of myself, cultivate myself, build myself, hold myself, care for myself, who will? No one will, is what Hillel HaZaken essentially is saying. Now, in a purely Eastern society, or the further east you go, that's almost a strange thing to say. What do you mean, mili, right? I mean, why are you worried about you so much? Yeah, but there is this element, and there's a lot of it in the words of the Hachamim that we can't get into tremendous detail in today, but it's there. And at the same time, it is Kol Yisrael Arevim Zelazeh, right? All of Israel are basically guarantors for each other. We take care of each other. We look at each other and are interested in what each one is doing in terms of the creation and support and fabric of society. So Avraham Avinu needs to deal with these things. And in Lekh Lekha, he is dealing with the setting of himself apart from his society. He's leaving home. He's leaving what's familiar. He's leaving what he knows. And he's becoming his own man. I mean, for goodness sakes, in this week's parasha, he fights a war. It's probably, it can very significantly be seen as the first biblical or ancient world war. I mean, these are major kings of the cradle of civilization fighting against each other. And Avraham is a major component of this war. He is not somebody that sits passively. He's not somebody that simply looks at the side and allows for things to run. He fights, he works on changing things, and for himself, in his own life, he had a mission. He had something that he was looking for. And we see that in terms of the trajectory of his life. The Hachamim pull this out very significantly. So the Hachamim say things like, Avraham Avinu from 3 years old was looking for truth. And as Harambam says, when he talks about this in the opening of Hilchot Avodah Zarah, he makes a point of recognizing En lo moreh. Avraham Avinu had no teacher. So this is really significant, because recognizing that we are a social species, recognizing that we really do conform to the society around us and behave in the ways that society behaves without even realizing that we do so, and we are quite adaptable and susceptible to those kinds of things. Avraham Avinu was doing something different. He was not simply taking what it was that the people were doing. He was looking for the source of all that is. That's our tradition about Avraham Avinu. He was looking for God. And he started at 3 years old. And the only difference between Avraham Avinu and every other 3-year-old who asks why and why and why and why and ad nauseum is that at a certain point what the 3-year-old hears is because that's the way it is. But Avraham Avinu never took that as an answer. And Harambam says that, based on 2 midrashim, that it was by 40 years old, the incessant questioning of Avraham Avinu brought him to the discovery of God. And that never ended for him. The entire questioning of his life and his identity moved towards that. Everything that he did in his life moves towards that. As a matter of fact, I think it's very significant that Avraham Avinu, although we know that he was an extremely wealthy man, lived in a tent for his whole life. And it wasn't because, we think of that and we think, that's just what everybody did in those times. No, it's not what everybody did in those times. I mean, remember, this is post-Tower of Babel. They built a tower to the sky. They were ready to build an entire city. And he's living in a tent. It's not because he can't afford it, and it's not because they didn't have the technology to build buildings. He wanted to be on the move. He wanted to be responsive. He wanted to be connected to the world. He wanted to be ready always to engage with God. And he built his life that way. And that is why Avraham Avinu is called, very early on, Ger v'toshav. Ger v'toshav. Right? You are both a citizen and a stranger with us, he's told. And that is very much who we are, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu actually calls Bnei Israel that. He says, Girim v'toshavim atem imadi, much later on in the Torah. You are both strangers and citizens with me. And what that means is that on the one hand, we stand on the move. We are always ready to respond. We are always ready to flow and be malleable with how it is that the world is moving, and at the same time we invest in the world in which we find ourselves as best we can. So what does that have to do with all of us? I mean, it says about Avraham Avinu that he fought against the delusions and illusions of idol worship during his lifetime, and that he set himself apart. And that although everyone else was doing something different, he set himself apart. And he was seen as being somebody who kind of marched to the beat of his own drummer. And although he was well respected, not so much because he was different, but because he fought wars and won them, and he was a very wealthy man. But nonetheless, Avraham Avinu found that his life was one that he had to do on his own. He had to essentially set himself apart from everyone else. And that's why it says in the Pasuk that he's called Avraham HaIvri, right? There's this war, and it says that there were refugees that came out of the war. It's in this week's parasha, Vayavo HaPalit. The refugees came out from the war, and they reported to Avraham what was going on in the war. And it says that they came to Avraham HaIvri, which is an interesting way to say it. And that the Hachamim say in Midrash Rabban, Bereshit Rabbah, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Kol ha'olam kulo me'ever nahar, or me'ever echad, right? The entire world was on one side, and Avraham was on the other side. Ever, right? He was on the other side, which essentially means that he got himself to a point in where the whole world was marching to one beat, and he was marching to a different beat. And he is called Avraham HaIvri, Avraham, the one on the other side, because of it. And so that's extremely significant, because it is the Av. It's our forefather. It is an attribute that the Torah prompts us, encourages us, teaches us that we really do need to take for ourselves. And so the Hachamim say that ultimately Israel is a nation that sits apart. He na'am levada dishkon. It is a nation that sits on its own, separate from everyone else. And that's something that unfortunately we feel in a very abrasive way when the world insists on reminding us that we are different than everyone else in their ugly and hateful way. But ultimately, it is about standing apart and doing things differently, recognizing that the purpose of life, and at the core, right, at its earliest sense, It's a question of being who you are, being who it is that you were created to be, to discover your identity by not doing what everyone else does. And rather recognizing that if you are going to be who you are, you need to be able to develop yourself and have discipline in being able to do that. So, social media is a big, big challenge for us today. I mean, it's not the only thing that was doing this. I mean, any kind of social interaction or plugging into the social milieu is challenging this way. But it's a big challenge because it's not just the fact that we are on social media. It's a question of who are we following on social media? Who are we listening to on social media? Who are we, without even realizing it, recognizing as praiseworthy and meaningful and valuable on social media? And who are we conforming to, even in the subtlest ways? What are we doing that everyone else is doing that is keeping us from being able to be all that we can be as human beings? Those are really serious questions. And part of it is just the fact that we want to be able to lean into comfort. And what Avraham Avinu did was he leaned into discomfort. He lived his life in an uncomfortable way. He lived in a tent. He did not do what everybody else did. He really did have to resist what was going on. And in some cases in his life, it was excruciatingly difficult. But he does do it. And it is something that we need to contemplate if we are interested in growing as human beings. What do I need to do that is different than everyone else? And when we do choose to do that, we really need to recognize that the way we do it is not with willpower. Willpower is cheap and weak. It's not resisting what it is that I see in front of me. It's discipline. And discipline comes more from, mitzvot, right? Essentially commandments. And what I mean by that is not just the mitzvot of the Torah, which are very important. We have to hear that these are commandments in the Torah. These are imperatives. But what are the mitzvot that we essentially give ourselves for our own lives? That works psychologically much more powerfully than willpower. So what's the difference between willpower and discipline and rules or commandments that we set for ourselves? The difference is that with willpower, if I say, I'm not eating dessert, I don't want to eat dessert, and then the dessert is put in front of me, and I see everybody else is eating dessert, I have to really grit my teeth not to taste the cake or not to taste the ice cream. But if I set a rule for myself, I don't eat dessert, or I don't eat sugar, it's not something that I do. Maybe I do it, maybe I set that rule for myself for a period of time. Psychologically, it's a completely different relationship to the situation. And that is where discipline comes from, right? And where you recognize this is my life. I define what it is that I do and what I don't do. And that's a very Avraham Avinu thing to do when we recognize that we're doing it for the greater good, for the goal ultimately that we have facing us in our life. That is essential. And that changes everything. And the truth of the matter is that Am Yisrael has lived this way as a people for 4,000 years, since Abraham Avinu. We have set ourselves apart. And it's because of this that we think differently. We dare to think differently. We approach the world differently. We see the world through different eyes. Then all a person needs to do is to be able to study Talmud, for example. Again, I'm speaking about Talmud. It's the source text of the wisdom of our people. To be able to have a sense of how did the Hachamim think? How did they see the world? I mean, it's remarkable, the insights that they have, the way that they look at things. There's a great book that my very dear friend Norman Lebrecht wrote called Genius and Anxiety, among the many books that he's written, in which he basically just looks at Jewish ingenuity. How did they come to what they came to, right? The inventions that Jewish people have made, the ways that they've changed and improved the world, and what was behind the things that caused them to do this. Brilliant book. It's a book that basically is filled with how we think like Avraham Avinu, how we think differently than others. And so I think that it's something for us to think about now in the time that we're living. To really do think about, when I'm on social media, what am I watching? What am I exposing myself to? Who am I following? What am I doing over and over and over again. And how am I forming my life? Am I thinking about my life? Am I thinking about my path? Am I looking towards where it is that I want to go, like Avraham Avinu did? Am I Lekh Lechaing? Am I going for myself to a destination that I know is going to be good for me, is going to be a blessing for me, is going to ultimately develop me into my best self? That is what the Torah prompts us to do. Remember that those are the first words that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Avraham Avinu, which sets the tenor for the entirety of Avraham Avinu's life and pretty much everything else that comes after Avraham Avinu, all of his children. The primal call to Avraham Avinu and his children is Lekh Lecha, go for you. And that means live your life in the fullest sense of your identity. Be all that you are. And that's not an easy thing for us to do, because we are more often than not living in faith and integrity to ourselves as God made us, in moral, ethical integrity, guided by Torah. What we're usually doing is what everyone else is doing, because it is the path of least resistance. We are programmed to do that, but we don't have to do that. And to be like Avraham Avinu is to resist that comfort, to resist the ease, the path of least resistance, to focus like a laser beam on where we are going and what our goals are. To be an Ivri, to be a Hebrew, is to be on the other side of the entire world. Now, I know that it's felt like that for us over the last few years, against our will. We have been made to feel that we are on the other side of the world, that the whole world is on one side and Avraham Avinu's children are on the other. Well, there are two ways that we can do that. The way that we should do that is to be able to be the light, to be full in ourselves, to find our integrity, to integrate ourselves into a whole identity, to be as HaKadosh Baruch Hu made us to be. And that requires an examining of our lives, a commitment to standing on the other side when everyone else is standing on one and we're on the other, a commitment to thinking differently, a commitment to discipline and resisting the path of least resistance, that is the social conformity that is so prevalent amongst us. Those are the great attributes of Avraham Avinu. And with that, I wish you all Shabbat Shalom. And if you do find that these Divrei Torah are meaningful to you, please do subscribe and share and like, because it helps it get to others who will hopefully find it meaningful as you do.